Is the average street dangerous? If you lived in the Victorian era, you would definitely answer yes. The streets of Victorian cities, especially London, were not just roads but veritable death traps. Every step on the cobblestones was a risk, every breath was a gamble, and survival in this stone labyrinth required incredible endurance. The contrast between the glamour of the aristocratic neighborhoods and the gloom of the working-class suburbs was not just social. It was carved in stone, soot, and the dirt of the streets themselves. Watch the video to the end to find out why a simple walk through the city in the 19th century was more dangerous than many military campaigns, and what invisible killer lurked in London's famous fog. What if I told you that everything you believed about the Victorian era was just a pretty picture? Real life in the city didn't begin with views of Big Ben, but with a deafening roar. Imagine thousands of horse-drawn carriages, their iron-rimmed wheels grinding over uneven cobblestones from morning until late at night, creating an unbearable noise from which it was impossible to escape. This rumble was not just background noise, but a constant source of stress that wore down the nervous system of the city's residents. Added to this were the cries of the coachman, the neighing of horses, and the whistles of the first steam engines. Silence was a luxury unavailable to most residents of this stone anthill. But sound was only half the trouble, because the streets also had their own unique smell. The pervasive smell of coal from thousands of chimneys mixed with the aromas of street food, waste, and the fumes from thousands of horses. This heavy, sour stench hung in the air constantly, permeating clothing and the walls of houses. Living in such a city meant being in a constant state of sensory overload. Your eyes watered from the acrid smoke, your ears were deafened by the noise, and your nose refused to perceive anything but the omnipresent stench. It was an environment hostile to human nature itself. It was this invisible backdrop, the noise and the smell, that was the first and most obvious manifestation of class inequality. The aristocracy and the wealthy middle class could afford to live in the quiet, green squares of the West End, far from the industrial areas. Their windows overlooked well-tended gardens, not smoking chimneys. The poor, however, were locked in the very epicenter of this hell. Their homes in the East End were adjacent to factories, docks, and the busiest streets. For them, the noise and stench were not a temporary inconvenience, but a constant reality from which there was no escape. This constant sensory assault affected both their health and their psyche. It led to chronic fatigue, irritability, and an inability to rest properly. The city literally sucked the life out of people before they even got to their exhausting jobs. Thus, the first thing any resident of a Victorian city encountered was not architecture, but an aggressive environment. It immediately divided everyone into those who could hide from it behind the high fences of their mansions, and those who were doomed to live inside this roaring cauldron. It was the first invisible wall between the classes. This wall grew stronger as the city expanded, absorbing more and more new territories. It became a monster that created conditions that were unbearable for its inhabitants. And the main source of chaos on its arterial streets was transportation. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about how constant noise and smells can affect society and divide it? Write about it in the comments. Want to know the main secret of Victorian streets? They were completely unsuited to the amount of traffic that poured onto them. Hundreds of thousands of horse-drawn vehicles, from elegant cabs and private carriages to heavy omnibus freight vans, created real traffic jams on narrow streets that could last for hours. Traffic rules as we understand them today simply did not exist. Everyone drove as they saw fit, which led to constant conflicts, collisions, and chaos. To get through faster, drivers did not mince words and often settled disputes with their fists and whips. For pedestrians, crossing such a street was a real test of courage and agility. There were no special crossings, and people had to literally maneuver between the speeding carriages. One wrong move could lead to serious injury, and such cases were a daily norm. The street became especially dangerous when it rained. The cobblestones were covered with slippery mud, and horses could easily slip and fall. In such situations, an uncontrolled carriage turned into an uncontrollable projectile, sweeping away everything in its path. The carriages of the aristocracy were the height of luxury and at the same time a source of envy and irritation. Drawn by thoroughbred horses with a personal coachman and footman, they raced through the streets, pushing aside more modest carriages. The owners of such carriages looked at the chaos on the streets from their windows as an annoying misunderstanding that interfered with their comfort. For the gentry and upper middle class, a private carriage was a status symbol. Doctors, lawyers, and bankers traveled in sturdy but more modest cabs. For them, time was money, and every minute spent in traffic meant lost profits. The majority of city dwellers and the working and lower middle classes traveled on foot. For them, these traffic-clogged streets were a daily obstacle on their way to the factory or office. They were forced to breathe the dust and dirt flying from under the wheels of the rich carriages. Street dirt was a separate problem. It consisted of dust, garbage, and huge amounts of horse manure. In dry weather, all this turned into dust, and in rainy weather, it turned into a sticky, foul-smelling slush that covered the streets with a thick layer. Special workers, known as crossing boys, cleared a path for pedestrians through this mud for a small fee. For a wealthy lady or gentleman, this was a minor expense. For a poor man, it was yet another humiliation, reminding him of his place in the world. Thus, the transport collapse was not just a technical problem. It was a visible embodiment of social inequality, where the speed and cleanliness of travel directly depended on the thickness of one's wallet. But even the richest could not escape another, even more terrible threat that came from underground. Ready to find out what was hiding in the London sewers? I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Victorian government. In the summer of 1858, London faced an enemy against which neither the army nor the navy could prevail. This enemy was an unbearable, pervasive odor that went down in history as the Great Stink. The cause was an abnormal heat wave that literally dried up the city's main waterway, the Thames. The river, which for centuries had served as the main sewer for a city of millions, turned into a slow-flowing stream of sewage. The contents of thousands of cesspools began to decompose in the sun. The smell was so strong that life in the city practically came to a standstill. People walked the streets with their noses covered with handkerchiefs soaked in perfume. The windows of houses were tightly closed despite the sweltering heat, but even that did not save them from the stench. The great stench became a great equalizer. It penetrated both the slums of the East End and the luxurious mansions of the aristocracy. Even in the hallowed halls of Parliament, sessions had to be interrupted because government officials' eyes were watering and their throats were scratchy. The curtains in the Parliament building were soaked in bleach in a desperate attempt to mask the smell. But it was all in vain. At one point, there was serious discussion about moving government and royal court sessions out of London. This disaster clearly demonstrated that the city's sewage system, if it could be called that, had completely collapsed. Cesspools were overflowing, their contents seeping into the soil, and from there into drinking water wells. The city was literally poisoning itself. It was this crisis that forced the authorities to act. Fear of the smell proved stronger than the reluctance to spend money. In record time, a law was passed to create a new, modern sewage system under the leadership of engineer Joseph Bazalgette. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century. Hundreds of kilometers of brick collectors were built to intercept sewage and carry it far beyond the city limits. It was a true feat of Victorian engineering. The Great Stink showed that sanitation issues cannot be ignored indefinitely in the pursuit of industrial growth. Even the most powerful empire in the world was vulnerable to its own waste. It was a harsh but necessary lesson. Thus, the crisis that could have destroyed the city ultimately saved it. It laid the foundation for transforming London into a cleaner and safer place. But while a revolution was taking place underground, another, no less dangerous threat was looming overhead. What I am about to show you would be banned in every country today. The sky above Victorian London was rarely blue. Thousands of factory chimneys and millions of domestic fireplaces spewed thick black smoke into the atmosphere around the clock, turning the city into one huge cauldron. This smoke, consisting of soot and sulfur dioxide, settled on everything. The buildings that we see today as noble stone structures were covered with a thick layer of black soot in the Victorian era. The clothes of the townspeople, especially light-colored ones, became dirty within minutes of going outside. Laundries were one of the most sought-after businesses, but even they couldn't always cope. White-collar workers' shirts turned gray by the end of the day, and ladies' dresses required constant cleaning. Cleanliness was a sign of wealth. It meant you could afford regular laundry and servants. But the real disaster was London's famous fog. Particles of smoke and soot in the air became condensation nuclei for moisture. The result was a thick, yellow-black smog that Londoners called pea souper. Such fog could descend on the city in a matter of minutes and last for several days. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Traffic on the streets came to a standstill, ships on the Thames stopped, and people could get lost just a few steps from their own homes. These fogs were not just an inconvenience, they were deadly. The acrid smog penetrated the lungs, causing attacks of suffocation and exacerbating respiratory diseases. The mortality rate in the city rose sharply during such fogs. Once again, it was the poor who suffered the most, living in the most polluted areas and unable to wait out the bad weather in a warm home. The working class was forced to go to the factories in all weathers, breathing in the poisoned air. For them, the fog was not a romantic phenomenon, but a harbinger of disease. The aristocracy and wealthy townspeople took refuge in their country estates or left for the continent. For them, the London fog was a topic for social conversation. This once again highlighted the gap between the classes, which seemed to live in different cities. Virtually no effort was made to combat the smoke. Factory chimneys were considered a symbol of progress and prosperity. No one thought about the long-term consequences for the health of the nation and the environment. It was only in the 20th century, after the particularly deadly Great Smog of 1952, that the authorities seriously tackled the problem. But for millions of Victorian-era residents, the soot-colored sky was as much a part of life as the cobblestones under their feet. How did people try to find at least an island of cleanliness in this sea of filth? The contrast between wealth and poverty in the Victorian era was so striking that London was effectively two different cities. These two worlds hardly intersected, separated by an invisible but solid wall of social status. The center of the rich world was the West End. Here, in areas such as Mayfair and Belgravia, stood the luxurious mansions of the aristocracy and the nouveau riche. The wide, well-lit streets were regularly cleaned. Instead of noisy factories, there were quiet squares and private parks, accessible only to the select few. The homes of aristocrats and bankers were veritable palaces. Inside, they had spacious rooms with high ceilings, expensive furniture, works of art, and a staff of servants ready to fulfill their every wish. The air here was cleaner, and life was calmer and more measured. The complete opposite was the East End, the heart of working class and poor London. Here in the areas of Whitechapel and Stepney, millions of people huddled in overcrowded apartment buildings called rookeries. The streets were narrow, dark, and constantly dirty. Working-class dwellings consisted of one or two tiny rooms for the whole family. Amenities, if any, were located in the courtyard and were shared by several dozen people. Sunlight hardly penetrated here due to the dense buildings and ubiquitous smog. Between these two extremes were the middle-class neighborhoods. Families of clerks, teachers, and small traders lived in standard townhouses with small front gardens. Their main goal was to maintain respectability and avoid sliding into the poverty of the East End. These three worlds existed in parallel. An aristocrat from the West End could live his entire life without ever visiting the slums of the East End. For him, the inhabitants of these areas were an invisible mass, objects of charity or fear. Even the shops and entertainment were different. The West End was home to expensive boutiques, elite clubs, and theaters. The East End had cheap pubs, street markets, and music halls for the common people. This geography of inequality was a self-perpetuating system. A native of the East End had very little chance of escaping his surroundings. Social mobility was very slow, and one's origins often determined one's entire future. Thus, the deadly streets were not the same everywhere. The degree of risk depended directly on the area of residence. But even in the most affluent neighborhoods of the West End, it was impossible to completely hide from the dangers that awaited outside one's own doorstep. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the lives of the rich? For the aristocracy and gentry, Victorian streets were not so much a danger as an annoying obstacle. Their world was one of lavish receptions, balls, and country hunts, and contact with the dirty reality of the city was kept to a minimum. Their primary mode of transportation was a private carriage. It was not just a means of transport, but a mobile living room that protected them from noise, dirt, and unwanted contact with commoners. Thanks to soft springs and velvet-upholstered seats, they did not even feel the unevenness of the cobblestones. The day of a member of high society was scheduled down to the minute, but not with work, rather with social obligations. Morning visits, afternoon walks in Hyde Park, evening trips to the opera. Their entire life was a public spectacle, subject to strict etiquette. They discussed the latest news from the colonies, political intrigues, and scandals in high society. They cared little about the problems of overpopulated slums or working conditions in factories. It was a distant, incomprehensible, and unpleasant world that was better not to think about. Lunches in aristocratic homes were a separate ritual. They could consist of a dozen courses, each of which was a work of culinary art. They ate a lot, abundantly, often to the point of physical discomfort, which was considered a sign of wealth and hospitality. At the same time, members of the upper class rarely managed their own affairs. Their estates and investments were handled by managers. They lived on rent, considering any work related to earning money to be humiliating. The upper middle class, industrialists and bankers, sought to emulate the aristocracy. They bought up country estates, sent their children to elite schools, and tried to marry into noble but impoverished families. For them, wealth was a way to buy a place in high society. They were united by a panic-stricken fear of the rabble. Any unrest in the working-class neighborhoods was perceived as a threat to their well-being and the established order. They supported harsh laws and strict morals, seeing them as protection from the chaos that reigned outside their gilded cage. They were at the top of the social pyramid, but their detachment from the real life of the country was enormous. They ruled an empire, but often had no idea how most of their compatriots lived. Their luxury was built on the labor of those they despised and feared. But how did those who were just one step below live, forced to immerse themselves in the chaos of the city streets every day? In the next chapter, we will learn about the world of middle-class respectability. For the middle class, the Victorian era was a time of opportunity and constant anxiety. It was the most diverse stratum of society, including both wealthy factory owners and modest clerks with fixed salaries. They all had one thing in common: the pursuit of respectability. Respectability meant having a clean, well-kept home, even if it was not as luxurious as that of the aristocracy. It meant strict adherence to moral standards, attending church, and having an impeccable reputation. This was the main asset that had to be protected. The head of a middle-class family, a doctor, lawyer, or manager, went to work every morning. Unlike an aristocrat, he earned his money through his labor and was proud of it. His commute to work was a daily encounter with the chaos of the streets, but he overcame it with dignity. The wife of a middle-class representative was the keeper of the home. Her task was to create a peaceful and orderly home, which was the complete opposite of the dirty and noisy city outside. Having at least one maid was a mandatory attribute of respectability. The lower middle class, teachers, clerks, small shopkeepers, was in the most precarious position. Their incomes were modest, but they desperately tried to distinguish themselves from the working class. Their main weapons were starched collars, cleanly polished shoes, and proper speech. It was the middle class that was the main consumer of goods produced in factories. They bought furniture, crockery, and clothing, striving to furnish their homes in the latest fashion. Their modest prosperity was the driving force behind the Industrial Revolution. Their homes were their fortresses, protecting them from the dangers and temptations of the big city. In the evenings, the family gathered in the living room to read together, play music, or have quiet conversations. This was their way of resisting the chaos of the outside world. Thus, the middle class was the backbone of Victorian society. They did not have the power of the aristocracy, but it was their values and labor that shaped the era. They were the builders of the empire, who risked everything every day to maintain their fragile prosperity. For the vast majority of the population, who made up the working class, life was reduced to a simple cycle: home, factory, home. Their day began long before dawn. Without alarm clocks, they woke up to the factory whistle that rang out over the rooftops of the slums. Most workers could not afford any form of transportation, not even the cheapest omnibus. Their only way to get to work was on foot. Every day they walked many kilometers along dark, dirty, and dangerous streets. The journey was exhausting. Workers walked in large groups to make it less frightening. Women tried to stick together, fearing attacks in dark alleys. The working day in a factory or mine lasted 12 or even 14, 16 hours. The work was monotonous, heavy, and often dangerous. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent, and accidents were commonplace. Working conditions were brutal. The workshops were deafeningly noisy, and the air was filled with dust or harmful fumes. There was no ventilation except for broken windows. For their hard labor, workers received a pittance, which was barely enough to pay for food in a tiny room. Any illness or injury meant inevitable poverty, as there was no sick leave or insurance. Women were often forced to work alongside men. Their survival in such conditions was a real miracle, a testament to incredible human endurance. They were cogs in a huge machine that ground their lives down without any pity. For them, the deadly streets were just part of the hostile world into which they were born. At the very bottom of Victorian society was the so-called subclass, people who did not even have permanent jobs. They were beggars, homeless people, casual day laborers, and prostitutes. They were the object of fear and contempt on the part of the more affluent classes of society. Their home was the filthiest and most dangerous slums of the East End. They slept in night shelters, where for a few pennies they could get a place on the dirty floor or on a sleeping rope. Sometimes they simply spent the night under bridges or in abandoned buildings. Their life was a daily struggle for a piece of bread. They begged for alms, collected coal or rags on the streets to resell, and did any dirty work for pennies. Survival depended solely on their own resourcefulness and luck. For these people, the streets of the city were both their home and a source of constant danger. They knew all the secret passages, all the back alleys, and all the dangerous places. Their lives were closely intertwined with the underside of city life. Respectable society saw them as the source of all evil. They were accused of laziness, drunkenness, and immorality. Charity was often humiliating and aimed not so much at helping as at correcting lost souls. At the same time, without this subclass, the city's economy could not function. They did the work that even factory workers refused to do. They collected garbage, cleaned sewers, and worked as dockers. These invisible people were a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. The city attracted them with promises of work, but could not provide for everyone. They were the flip side of Victorian prosperity, its dark side, which was not talked about in polite society. Despite all the horror, the Victorian era was also a time of great reform. Gradually, society began to realize that it was impossible to continue living in such conditions. The impetus for change was often not humanitarian considerations, but fear of epidemics and social unrest. The key moment was the construction of a new sewer system after the Great Stink. This grandiose project not only cleaned up the Thames, but also significantly improved the sanitary conditions in the city. It became a symbol of man's ability to tame the chaos he himself had created. At the same time, work began on improving the streets. They were paved with smooth asphalt, which reduced noise and dirt. Gas and then electric lighting appeared, making the streets safer at night. The first forms of public transport appeared, accessible not only to the rich. Horse-drawn carriages and then trams allowed workers to settle further away from factories in healthier areas. This marked the beginning of the formation of suburbs. The construction of the world's first subway in 1863 was a real revolution. Despite the smoke and soot from steam locomotives, the subway made it possible to cross the huge city quickly and cheaply. It changed people's very perception of distance and time. Public parks began to appear, conceived as the green lungs of the city. They gave ordinary citizens the opportunity to relax in nature without leaving London. This was a recognition of the human right to rest and fresh air. Medicine also developed. Scientists such as John Snow proved the link between dirty water and the spread of disease. This led to the creation of centralized water supply systems that delivered clean, filtered water to homes. Of course, these changes happened slowly and unevenly. Wealthy areas were improved first, and progress reached the slums much later. But the process had begun, and the city gradually became more livable. The Victorian era itself gave rise to problems that it then heroically solved. It left behind not only dirty streets and gloomy slums, but also the foundations of the modern metropolis. It was a time of extremes, cruelty, and great achievements. It was in this boiling cauldron of contradictions that the world we live in today was born. The lessons learned from the mistakes of the Victorian era formed the basis of modern urban planning, sanitation, and social legislation. We can see that Victorian streets were not just the backdrop for historical novels. They were the arena of a daily struggle for survival, where each class fought its own battle. Glamour and poverty, progress and unsanitary conditions, luxury and despair, all mixed together in the mud under the wheels of cabs and in the soot of London smog. This era clearly showed how closely the urban environment and social structure were intertwined. The streets were a mirror reflecting the full depth of the inequality that divided society. Which street you walk down determined not only your present, but also your future. The story of the deadly Victorian streets is not just a tale of the past. It is a warning about what happens when technological development outpaces social responsibility. And it is a reminder of how long and difficult the road was to creating the safe and comfortable cities that we take for granted today. What other topics from the history of everyday life or hidden dangers of the past would you like to see on our channel? Share your ideas in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next investigations.